Shalom. Welcome to Understanding Paul. We are in our second lesson. In our first lesson, we discussed Paul's opening argument, if you will, which is the foundation for his, the entire book of Romans. Let me back up a little bit. In this series, what we're endeavoring to do is to demonstrate that there is no conflict between the teachings of Paul and Torah. The fact is that there are those who have misunderstood the teachings of Paul as being antinomian. Antinomian means against the Torah. These range on the one hand from those who have rejected Paul because they misunderstood him as teaching against the Torah, and therefore they rejected him and went into a anti-Pauline Ebionite, or even rejected the Messiah over the issue. Or on the other hand, we have had people who have, or perhaps they were rabbinic Jews that were using the anti-missionaries, using the alleged claim, at least, that Paul was opposed to Torah to discredit the writings of the Ketuvim Netzarim. On the other hand, we have Christians, dispensationalists, etc., who teach that Paul did in fact teach that the law had been abolished, and instead of rejecting Paul and the Messiah, which Deuteronomy 13 tells us that we should do if that was, well, at least Paul, Deuteronomy 13 tells us that we should reject Paul if in fact he was teaching against the Torah. Instead of doing that, they reject the Torah. They accept a false teaching that the Torah was abolished, which Paul did not teach, and we'll be covering that as we go through all of Paul's writings. And right now we're going through Romans, and the idea is that we're going to go through every word that Paul wrote line by line, and this will in itself prove that Paul never said anything that was not compatible with Torah. What we're going to be doing is something unique. It's never really been done, in my opinion, in the materials that I have seen, and that is we're going to take what Paul wrote in the original Hebrew and Aramaic rather than the Greek. Sometimes we may show where the Greek mistranslated something, but we're going to look at the original Hebrew and Aramaic, and we're going to apply Jewish rules of interpretation, Jewish hermeneutics to the text, and understand what Paul wrote in terms of Second Temple era Judaism, and seek to understand Paul. Okay, last week, or last teaching, we discussed the first three chapters and a little bit into the fourth chapter of Romans. And this was kind of biting off the first piece of Romans because it was necessary to cover that amount of material to cover Paul's foundational opening argument, which is based upon the sixth rule of Hillel. Paul was presenting a Medenu homiletic midrash, which is which literally means we learn, or we are learning, or we shall learn. And in other words, it's a midrash that tries to derive something from the text. Of course, all midrashim do this, but this is a special kind of structure. And in this type of a midrash, and what Paul is doing, uses certain key words to pull passages together. And in this case, Paul is also applying the sixth rule of Hillel. You see, Paul was a student of Gamaliel, the grandson of Hillel, and so Paul is well schooled in the seven rules of Hillel and rabbinic methods of hermeneutics. And so Paul is applying them to the Tanakh. And remember, the Tanakh is the basis for Paul's teaching, as we read in Acts chapter 17. When he was teaching the Bereans, it says that they checked the scriptures. They were looking in the scriptures to see if what he said was true. which means that the only scriptures they had was the Tanakh. So that means that Paul's teaching was rooted in the Tanakh, and we're going to see that. We do see that as we study Paul here. And in the first opening portion, Paul presents two sets of passages from the Tanakh that appear, at least on the surface, to contradict one another. This is very similar to the opening of the Tanya. The Tanya is the foundational work of the Chabad school of thought within Hasidism. And the Tanya opens with a conflict with two passages that seem to conflict with one another over the issue of what a righteous and unrighteous person are, basically, just to generalize, which is interesting because Paul also opens with two sets of conflicting passages over the question of who is and is not a tzaddik, a righteous individual, or who is not can be considered a tzaddik by Elohim, at least. So Paul presents two sets of passages that conflict. This is the sixth rule of Hillel, which says that two passages seem to conflict with one another until a third passage resolves the conflict. And it's similar to another rule called the analogy of Scripture that says if we understand one passage in such a way as to conflict with another passage, we're misunderstanding one or both passages. Okay, so in the first opening portion of Romans, Paul opens with Habakkuk 2:4, the just shall live by faith. This is a foundational teaching for Paul. Okay, the just shall live by faith. Many people don't realize that, but that's the Tanakh. That's Habakkuk 2:4. And he contrasts that with another passage that says that there's none righteous, not one. Okay, well, if the tzaddik, the righteous, shall live by faith, and there's no tzaddik, not one, then just and righteous are the same word in Hebrew. Then how can it be that the just shall live by faith if there's no such thing as a just man? Why? So here we have two passages that seem on the surface to conflict. And then Paul cites two other passages that seem to conflict. One of them is that he will judge each man according to his works, and another passage says, "Blessed is he whose unrighteous deeds are forgiven him." Again, how can it be both ways? It seems to conflict. And so Paul finally introduces a third passage, or in this case one might say a fifth passage, that resolves both conflicts. And the passage he cites is Genesis 15:6. Abraham believed, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And the word for belief and faith, emunah, same word in Hebrew. And so Paul's key passages that he uses to prove his theology that we are saved by emunah, we are made righteous by emunah, is Habakkuk 2:4 and Genesis 15:6, which are, by the way, Old Testament passages. So this disposes of the idea that this is a so-called New Testament teaching that dispensationalists and ultra-dispensationalists will put forward, because in fact Paul's argument is based on so-called Old Testament passages. The just shall live by faith, and Abraham believed, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Excuse me. So also the Targum to Genesis 15:6 says that Abraham believed in the word of Yahweh, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And we'll explore that more later, but that also is profound to Paul's argument as it proceeds. Today we're going to back up a little bit to the beginning of chapter 3. And the reason we're going to do that is because I want to explore another element from a rabbinic exegesis standpoint, from the format of rabbinic texts, that Paul also engages in. Paul engages in a dialogue with a hypothetical opponent. if you want to call him an opponent, a hypothetical individual who is misunderstanding him at each and every turn. And Paul does this because he fears that he may well be misunderstood, which is what happened. Of course, Kepha in his writing says that Paul is difficult to understand. Before we go further, one of Paul's foundational points is basically, we find it in the Mishnah, in Avot 1:3, and it's the teaching of Antigonus of Soko. Antigonus of Soko said, it says in Avot 1:3, Antigonus of Soko received the Torah from Simon the Righteous. He would say, do not be like servants who serve the master on condition of receiving a reward, but be like servants who serve the master not on condition of a reward, and let the fear of heaven be upon you. The teaching of Antigonus of Soko was, therefore, that we're not keeping the Torah like we're trying to earn something. In fact, the Tanya is all about this also. The Tanya, where we keep the Torah for its own sake. And the depth of that is a whole different teaching we could get into in the Tanya, but the important thing here is we don't keep it because we do not keep Torah because we're trying to bribe Elohim. Oh, well, if I do this, will you give me salvation? No. We can't earn salvation. We're not trying to earn salvation. That is not what Torah is about. That is what the Talmud says the Torah is not about in Mishnah Avot 1:3. Okay? And interestingly enough, Antigonus of Soko was misunderstood by the Sadducees. One of his students was a guy named Zadik, and Zadik misunderstood him as meaning that if we're not trying to, if we're not keeping the Torah because there's a reward in the afterlife, that he concluded that there must not be an afterlife. And that began the Sadducean teaching that there is no hereafter, there's no resurrection, no afterlife, none of that. And that was the beginning of the Sadducees as a result of the drastic misunderstanding of Antigonus of Soko. The misunderstanding of Paul likewise created an apostate group, antinomian Christianity. Okay, so Paul is terribly concerned that he could, like Antigonus of Soko, become misunderstood. And so he argues, if you will, with himself. And so throughout the book of Romans, and in fact other parts of Paul's writings, particularly in Galatians, Paul will propose, he will propose points that he is not teaching. He will propose a misunderstanding of what he says. And then in the process he'll turn around and say, is this what we're saying? And then he'll turn around and he'll use a key word, chas, in Aramaic, meaning absolutely not. The King James Version has God forbid, but there's a lot of translations put God forbid. But in fact, there is no word for God. It doesn't say Elohim anything or Allah. There's no word for God there. It's just chas. It's absolutely not. Certainly not. No. In the strongest terms. No. The same word in the Aramaic is used in the rabbinic writings, in the Jerusalem Talmud particularly, in a very similar way to say, absolutely not. Okay. So we begin back at the beginning of Romans 3. Therefore, what is the advantage of the Jew? Or what is the profit of the circumcision? Okay, he poses a question. And he answers the question exactly the opposite way of what Gentile Christianity today would think his answer is. Much in everything. First, that they were entrusted with the words of Eloah. Now in verse 3, then he poses another question. He says, for if some of them did not believe, did they make void the faith of Eloah in that they did not believe? So he poses the question, does the fact that some don't have Emunah, particularly speaking of the Jewish people, some people are apostate or are not do not have this emunah, this faith? Does that negate the faith? And of course his answer, verse 4, Chas, absolutely not. For Eloah is true and every man is false, as it is written, you should be upright in your words and innocent when they judge you. Then verse 5 begins another possible interpretation, if you will, of Paul's words. But if our unrighteousness establishes the righteousness of Eloah, in other words, if the fact that we're unrighteous, okay, we're a rasha. We're a rasha in the sense that we don't, we're not perfect keeping the Torah. Therefore, by the strictest definition, we're a rasha. And yet, our, as Paul is going to point out as he continues forward, we live by emunah, and we are reckoned as righteous, as a tzaddik, even though we're a rasha, because of our emunah, our faith. What shall we say? That's a key phrase you'll see in Paul. What shall we say, or what shall we say then? What he's about to propose is an absurdity, something that is not what he is saying, but which someone might misconstrue him as saying. Is Eloah unrighteous who brings to pass wrath? I speak as a son of man. He wants to clarify himself here because what he's saying might be termed as blasphemy, but he's saying, I'm talking like a person might talk. I'm asking a question that a person might ask or might misinterpret. Is Elohim unrighteous then when he brings his wrath upon the unrighteous? And he answers again, Chas, absolutely not. If so, how will Elohim judge the world? And then in verse 7 and 8, he poses yet another question. But if the truth of Eloah has been increased by my falsehood to his glory, why therefore am I judged as a sinner? Okay, so why am I judged as a sinner if the fact that I can be reckoned as righteous, as he's going to show, I live by faith and so on, how can I be reckoned as judged as a sinner? Or perhaps we should say, as they blaspheme concerning us and say that we say, that we should do evil so that good might come. In other words, some people are saying that our position is that we should transgress the Torah. We should be unrighteous. We should intentionally be a rasha. We should engage in unrighteous behavior because the resulting redemption is a good thing. The fact that we can be redeemed and we can still be regarded because of our emunah as being righteous is such a wonderful thing that we should, well, he'll talk about this all later, continue to transgress the Torah. Their judgment is reserved to justice. Those who slanderously say that we teach this, they are reserved for judgment by Elohim. How then do we hold the superiority, though we from before determined concerning the Jews and concerning the Arameans that they are all under sin? As it is written, and then he goes into the scripture quotations that build a rule that says that there's none righteous, not one. In fact, some of the passages actually say that, which he contrasts with Habakkuk 2:4, because he's then going to overcome that objection as well. Okay, then we covered that in our last lesson, so let's get to verse 31. In verse 31, chapter 3, again, he proposes a misunderstanding. He says, therefore, do we make the Torah of no effect by trust, by faith? So is does this teaching then mean that the Torah is nullified by emunah? The Torah doesn't need to be kept anymore? The Torah is nothing? And his answer is, chas, absolutely not. On the contrary, he says, we uphold the Torah. Okay, so that's chapter 3, and those are the misunderstandings that Paul presents and overcomes. And it's interesting that many of those misunderstandings of Paul are they're also essentially misunderstandings of the teaching of Antigonus of Soko, that they are essentially forms of the misunderstanding that of Paul, the Gentile Christianity holds to today. Now remember, we said that this was a Yom Medenu homiletic midrash, and it's the resolution of that midrash is Genesis 15:6, and that is presented to us when we get to Romans chapter 4, as we saw last week at the beginning of Romans chapter 4. And so in chapter 4, Paul will not only present Genesis 15:6 as the resolution to the conflicts that he's presented, but he's also going to show that Genesis 15:6 is going to pose, he's going to go through the process of drash. You know, the word drash comes from a root meaning to thrash, like you thrash grain to get all the grain out of it. It's like you're thrashing information out of the text. And that's what Paul's going to do in Romans chapter 4. He's going to start squeezing all the possible information, what we can learn from our application of Genesis 15:6 in this case. And of course, Genesis 15:6 is a case study in who? Avraham. And so Romans 4 is about Avraham. Now, the point will be then to apply what we learn about Avraham to other people, to ourselves today, or in the first century, or in the 21st century, or in what other time it might be, to apply what we can learn. So we get to Romans chapter 4, let's verses 1 through 8, and Paul's point here will be the teaching of Antigonus of Soko, basically, that Avraham's faith was apart from works. In other words, Avraham his faith was not earning him any. It wasn't it was apart from works. It was not something that he did to earn anything. Chapter 4, verse 1. What then are we saying concerning Avraham, the patriarch, that he obtained righteousness by the flesh? Did he obtain his... No, of course, Genesis 15:6 says he obtained his righteousness. He was reckoned as righteous by faith, not by the flesh, not by something that he did in his human capacity in the flesh, by the flesh. For if Avraham by works was justified, he had boasting, but not toward Elohim. In other words, if Avraham had been reckoned as a tzaddik, he was reckoned as a tzaddik because of his wonderful works, then he had every reason to boast, but not. It doesn't do any good for Elohim. It doesn't boast about the power of Elohim because Avraham did it. Didn't need Elohim. In fact, end of story, we have Avraham as our patriarch. We can build a humanist society based upon humanist doctrine, based upon what Avraham accomplished, because Elohim had nothing to do with it, because it was all Avraham's works. Avraham did it. Avraham made himself righteous by his works. Who needs Elohim? Verse 3. For what does the scripture say? Avraham trusted Elohim, and it was reckoned to him for righteousness. Now to him who labors, his reward is not reckoned to him as a favor, as chesed, but as that which is owed to him. Okay, this is chesedism. Antigonus of Soko, by the way, was the leader of the Chassidim in the days of the Maccabees. It was a Chassidic teaching. It was teaching that we're not trying to earn, we're not keeping the Torah because we're trying to earn something. Instead, our righteousness and our salvation is the result of hesed, undue favor. Grace, if you will. Verse 5. But to him who does not labor, but who believes only in him who justifies sinner, his trust is reckoned to him for righteousness. As also David said concerning the blessing of the man to whom are reckoned righteousness without works, saying. Okay, before we go further, what Paul is saying here is that when we go pick up our paycheck, for example, at the end of the week, you go pick up your paycheck. You may say thank you when they hand you your paycheck, but you really don't have to thank them. It's just formality of politeness. In reality, they owe you the money. You earned it. It's yours. It was an even exchange. You did X amount of work, agreed upon to be paid X amount of money, and you're not thanking them really. It's not a gift when they give you your paycheck. They owe that money to you because that was the deal. Okay. So it's the same way with being reckoned righteous by emunah. Okay, that is something that we are thankful to Elohim for, and something that is chesed, undue favor. It wouldn't be chesed from Elohim if it had to be earned, or if it was earned. So we're not keeping Torah as if we're trying to earn something. We keep Torah for its own sake. As David said concerning the blessing of the man to whom Elohim reckons righteousness without works, saying, Blessed are those whose iniquity is forgiven, and those whose sins are covered. And blessed is the man in whom Elohim will not reckon his sin. Is this blessing therefore upon the circumcision or upon the uncircumcision? This is actually the beginning of Paul's next argument. Paul's next thing that we can learn from Genesis 15:6. Another thing we can learn from Genesis 15:6 is that when Abraham was counted as righteous because of his emunah in Genesis 15:6, he hadn't been circumcised yet. That happened in Genesis 17, several years later. Okay. Is this blessing therefore upon the circumcision or upon the uncircumcision? For we say that trust was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. How then was it reckoned to him in circumcision or in uncircumcision? It was not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. In other words, Paul, as I just pointed out, Abraham was reckoned as righteous in Genesis 15:6 because of his emunah while he was yet uncircumcised. It wasn't until several years later in Genesis 17 that he was circumcised. For he received circumcision. Now verse 11 is important. A lot of Gentile Christians, if you will, antinomians would rather this not be here. For he received circumcision, the sign and seal of the righteousness of his trust, and the sign and seal of the righteousness of his trust that was in uncircumcision, that he might become the father to all those who believe from the uncircumcision, that it might be reckoned also to them for righteousness. Now, if Genesis 15:6 is the pattern, as Paul is pointing it out, and if we are to learn from it and then apply Genesis 15:6 to ourselves, which is the point of a Yahweh homiletic midrash, what we are learning, okay, and we say, okay, what we can learn from here, and let's bring it over here. Abraham believed when he was uncircumcised, and he was counted as righteous while he was uncircumcised in Genesis 15, and then later in Genesis 17, he received circumcision, the sign and seal of the righteousness of his trust or his faith, that he was in uncircumcision. So what can we learn if we're going to fairly apply Genesis 15:6 to Gentiles who embrace emunah? Okay, while yet uncircumcised, then the conclusion that we lead is, see, Abraham didn't continue to be uncircumcised. As a result of his faith while he was uncircumcised, he later became circumcised, is what verse 11 is telling us. So the saving faith that makes a Gentile righteous while they're uncircumcised ultimately should lead to them also in the pattern of Abraham becoming circumcised. Okay? This is reflecting back on Acts 15, which is a whole different discussion, but in Acts 15, there was a debate over whether a person had to be circumcised to be saved or not. And the resolution was that no, they didn't have to be circumcised to be saved. Doesn't mean they don't have to be circumcised at all, ever, or shouldn't be, but it means in order to be saved. By the way, Rabbinic Judaism teaches the same thing. You don't have to be circumcised to be saved. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be circumcised, ultimately, but because we keep the Torah for its own sake, not because we're trying to earn something. Okay, and the father of the circumcision, not to those who are from the circumcision only, but also those who follow in the footsteps of the faith of the uncircumcision of our father Abraham. But where do those footsteps lead? They lead from Genesis 15 to Genesis 17. If you follow in his footsteps and keep following, then you get to the point in Genesis 17 where he ultimately was circumcised. For not by the Torah. Well, let's start. The next argument starts in verse 13. Abraham's belief also was before the Torah was given. Okay? For not by Torah was the promise made to Abraham and to his seed that he would be heir forever. That word forever is mistranslated in the Greek heir to the world. The Aramaic word is Alma, which is the Aramaic parallel to Olam, the Aramaic cognate to Olam, almost the same spelling, and it's pronounced differently, but it's almost the same spelling. Olam has exactly the same meaning as Olam, and it means world, but it can also mean eternity or forever, or age, in this case forever. But by the righteousness of his trust, or by the righteousness of his faith. Emunah is trusting faithfulness. It's not just belief. It is actual trusting faithfulness. For if those that are from the Torah only become heirs, trust becomes void and the promise fails. For the Torah, apart from trust, is a worker of wrath. For there was no Torah. When there was no Torah, there was no transgression of the Torah. Okay, so Paul's point here is that a person can be saved, have emunah, and be reckoned as righteous before they receive the Torah. Just as Israel, through Abraham, was reckoned as righteous by faith before Abraham and his seed received the Torah. That doesn't mean that we didn't receive the Torah or that we don't receive the Torah. It just means that there is an order of things. And when we haven't received the Torah yet, when a person hasn't received the Torah yet, Elohim doesn't judge them for not keeping Torah. Okay? As they learn the Torah, then and they commit to the Torah, then they're obligated to observe the Torah. Okay? It's, again, not to earn anything. It's never to earn anything. The Torah is not money. It's not something we buy redemption from Elohim with. Okay? The Torah is kept for its own sake, because keeping Torah connects us with Elohim. It allows us to cleave to Elohim. That's a whole other teaching we could get into as to why we keep Torah. To a certain extent, Paul will touch on it, where there are reasons to keep Torah, but earning righteousness is definitely not part of it. Because of this, we will be justified by faith, which is by favor. By the way, we're about to start the next thing Paul says that we can learn from Abraham, from the case study of Genesis 15:6. And that is that Abraham's faith blessed the Goyim, okay, and the Gentiles. Because of this, we will be justified by faith, because which is by favor, and promise will be sure to all his seed, not to those who are from the Torah only, but also those who are from the faith of Abraham, or trust of Abraham, who is the father of us all. In other words, the faith of Abraham that preceded the giving of the Torah. Doesn't mean that we don't receive the Torah. It means there's an order of things. And there's a group of people here that are going to be addressed and talked about who are outside of the Torah at this point. They're not aware, they're not keeping Torah, they're not part of the Torah covenant. As it is written, I have placed you a father to a multitude of the Goyim. Now, if we follow the passages that were to the strain of passages about Abraham being the father of a multitude of Goyim, and then the blessings that are given later to Joseph, that he will also be a fullness of Goyim, fullness of Gentiles. We follow these passages through. And then we see in Isaiah chapter 9, in reference to Galil and to the people that live there that were of the law of the house of Israel, we see that they are called Gentiles. Okay, and also in Hosea we see that the house of Israel is told at a certain point, I will say to those that were my people, you are not my people. In other words, they became reckoned as Gentiles. They became part of the Gentile people. But there's a redemption for them, a return, a reunion of the two houses of Israel built into the redemption of the Gentiles. Before Eloah, in whom you believed, who makes alive the dead and calls those things that are not as though they are. And without hope he believed in hope that he might be a father to a multitude of the Goyim, as it is written, thus will be your seed. Okay, starting in verses 19 through 25, Paul's emunah was not simple belief. It was trusting faithfulness. It was unwavering. And he was not weak in his faith, considering his dead body that was 100 years old and the dead womb of Sarah. He did not doubt the promise of Eloah as one lacking trust or faith, but was strong in trust and gave praise to Eloah. And he was convinced that Eloah was able to fulfill that which he had promised to him. This is all in Genesis 18, which is, by the way, after Genesis 17. So by this time he was circumcised. Because of this, it was reckoned to him for righteousness. Not for his sake only was this written, but his trust was reckoned for righteousness. But also for our sakes, because he is also prepared to reckon righteousness to those who trust in him, raised our Adon Yeshua the Messiah from among the dead, who was delivered up for our sins and rose so that he might justify us. Okay, so this is what we can, the initial points that we can learn from the case study of Abraham in Genesis 15:6. We learn that Abraham's faith was apart from his works. He didn't earn anything. He wasn't trying to earn anything. It was counted to him as righteousness. Abraham believed before he was circumcised, and then that later led to him being circumcised as a seal of the righteousness of his emunah, of his faith. Okay? Abraham believed before the Torah was given, before he received, or his seed received the Torah. So his emunah counted him as righteous before he entered the Torah covenant, or his people entered the Torah covenant. Abraham's belief was to be a blessing to his seed, who were the Goyim, but not, and the interpretation of that, if you look into it, is actually a reference primarily to the 10 lost tribes, but the Gentiles also being redeemed and bringing and coming forth and becoming Jews, as we read in Esther 8:17, for example, about those who were drawn to the one true faith, they, quote, became Jews. Don't be surprised in Ephesians, I think it's chapter 2, verse 11, Paul refers to the Ephesians that he's writing to as former Gentiles. A lot of people don't get that. Former Gentiles. What are former Gentiles? Recent proselytes to Judaism. Same thing in 1 Corinthians 12:2. He refers to them as formerly Gentiles, which means they were recent converts to Judaism. Okay. So finally we get to Abraham's faith was an unwavering faith, and it brought fruition to Israel and to the bringing forth of the nation of Israel, ultimately the coming of the Torah, through the promise that was given to Abraham in Genesis 18, which, by the way, was after his circumcision in Genesis 17. So if we take this as a case study, what we learn is that a person who is not already in the Torah, not living in Torah observant Judaism, can in fact be counted as righteous and receive the Messiah before entering into Torah observant Judaism. It doesn't mean that they don't or shouldn't. It just means that the order of things is that happens first. It can happen before they receive the Torah, just as happened for Abraham before Israel received the Torah. It happened to Abraham before Abraham was circumcised, it can happen therefore also before circumcision. But that doesn't mean that circumcision didn't happen. In fact, if we follow the footsteps of Abraham, as Paul recommends, in following the footsteps of Abraham from Genesis 15 to Genesis 18, because Paul ends in it with Genesis 18 in chapter 4, verses 19 through 25. We pass through Genesis 17 in between, and in fact Paul even mentions that Abraham did in fact become circumcised as a sign and seal of the righteousness of his emunah in Genesis 17. So what we learn from Romans chapter 4 is effectively that righteousness and salvation can precede receiving the Torah and receiving circumcision, and also that this is a great blessing to the Gentiles, and especially to the house of Israel, that are reckoned as Gentiles. Okay, we're going to go ahead and stop here, and we're going to pick up again next time at the beginning of Romans chapter 5. So until I hope you will join us for Understanding Paul Part 3 as we begin with Romans chapter 5. Until then, shalom.